Right folks, in these videos I'm going to show you how to set up various bits and pieces in Unreal 5 for your microgame project. They can of course be used beyond the microgame project, but I thought I would just create them for you to give you a little bit of help with that. The first video is going to be go through setting up your first person character. It's going to include things like setting up the game mode, the controller and the character itself. When I say controller and character, I'll explain that a little bit later. I do not mean the like Xbox controller, for example. Then we're going to go through setting up your inputs, in other words your key bindings, and then we're going to add movement, jumping, sprinting, crouching, and I thought I'd throw in like a toggleable torch. Some of you asked for that, so I'm going to put that in at the end as well. The next video I'm going to move on to do automatic doors, so when the player approaches a door it opens, when they leave it closes. Then I'll do interactable doors that the player has to click on in order to open them. We'll do keys in doors, so a specific key to unlock a specific door. We'll do a collectible item counter, so you have to collect X number of items to unlock a door, or X number of items to complete the game. We'll do timers as well, so you can add a timer mechanic to your game. Collect the items before the time runs out, for example. And then we'll go through like building levels using the geometry tool, blocking levels out using the geometry tool. And then we'll throw in some stuff with lights, and hopefully we'll get to sound and music as well, but we'll see how far we get. So this first video is setting up your game mode and your first person character and some of the bits and pieces involved with that. I'm just going to go back to here so it looks a bit like those. Okay, so when you're inside of Unreal Engine, to access your content drawer, if you click down in the bottom left hand corner, it'll open up the content drawer, and then when you click away it'll close down again. I quite like to have that docked to the screen permanently, so I'm going to click the content drawer and then click on dock in layout. It now becomes the content browser and it's permanently docked to the bottom of the screen. Nice and handy. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly without explaining too much, just to save on time. So in the main content folder, I'm going to right click and create a new folder which I will call Blueprints. And if you really want to, you can colorize this by right clicking, click on set color, and then obviously I'm going to choose blue for blueprints. I'm going to double click to open up the blueprints folder, and let's make our 3 base blueprints that we need: the game mode, the player controller and the player character. So let's right click, choose blueprint class. We're going to go for game mode first. The game mode, basically, as it says here, defines the game being played, its rules, scoring and other facets of the game type. So this basically what we're going to use it for at the moment is just to say we want to spawn in this particular character and we want to use this particular controller to pass input to our character. When I say a controller, again, I don't mean like an Xbox controller. It is literally a game blueprint type that will possess our character and enable us to control it. So let's create our game mode base. Let's call it BP underscore game mode, not game mod, game mode. And then now let's make our controller. So we're going to right click again, choose blueprint class, and we're going to go for player controller. As you can see, a player controller is an actor responsible for controlling a pawn used by the player. And here you can see that a character is a type of pawn that includes the ability to walk around. So like a pawn here is an actor that can be possessed and receive input from a controller. So a character is a type of pawn that comes with some bits and pieces that make it nice and easy for us to set things like how quickly it can walk, how it moves around, how it's influenced by gravity, how it collides with things. And the controller is the thing that we use to add input to our pawn so that we're able to control it. So let's choose player controller. We'll call it BP underscore player controller underscore 01. And now let's make our character. So let's go right click and blueprint class again. This time we're going to choose character and we'll call it BP underscore player character underscore 01. So let's go into our game mode by double clicking, and over here we're going to say, right, what player controller class do we want to use and what default pawn class do we want to use. So let's click on the player controller and we want to use our player controller that we just made, and then in default pawn class we want to choose our player character that we just made. compile and save that, and you can close your game mode blueprint down for now because we're not going to need it. We do, however, need to go into our project settings to make sure that our project is using our game mode, because at the moment, if we just press play right now, I'm just like a floating head that can kind of fly around inside of our level because it's not using any type of controller or character or game mode for that matter. So let's press escape. Go into the project settings. If by any chance you don't see project settings up there, it's nice and easy to access. Just go edit, project settings. Let's go into maps and modes under the project section, and here where we've got default game mode, we're going to change that to our BP game mode that we made. So once we put that in, the project is using our game mode, and therefore we'll use our controller and our character. We can check that by pressing play, and we shouldn't be able to move around anymore because our character and controller are the ones that have spawned in, and they obviously can't move yet. Press escape to jump out. One thing I will do is, for now, I'm just going to put a player start point into the level so that we spawn in at the same place every single time. You can just search for that up here. Mine's there because I've used it recently, but you can just search for player and you can find a player start. Put that in there. Okay, so that just determines which way our player is going to face. You can see this light blue arrow determines which way you're going to be facing when you spawn in, and this is the location that you're going to spawn in. Yeah, cool, we'll do that. Okay, the first thing we need to do now then is to set up our inputs so we can get our character moving around. So let me just close that search term down. Let's go back to our project settings and scroll down to input, and this is where we're going to establish our action and axis mappings. I'm not going to talk a great deal about the difference here, hopefully it'll become quite evident, but essentially an action mapping will execute when you press the button and then will execute again when you release it. An axis mapping is on a scale from -1 all the way up to 1, or any scale that you determine, but by default it will be -1 to 1, and it is executing all of the time. So every frame that is rendered, the axis mapping is constantly firing. You use this for things like movement, so you can imagine with the thumbstick, right? When the thumbstick is not being pushed up or down, as in like, you know, forwards or backwards, the axis value is at 0. When you push that thumbstick all the way to the top, the axis value goes to 1. When you push it all the way to the bottom, it goes to -1. If you were to push it halfway to the top, it would be 0.5. Likewise, halfway to the bottom, it would be 0.5. So I'll try and demonstrate that. I'll go grab my controller and plug it in, and I'll show you how that works just so you can understand it. But for now, let's just set up our action and axis mappings. So action mappings are useful for things like jump or interact, sprint, crouching, things that just require a button press or a button release. Axis mappings are better used for things like movement, which can be used for the thumbstick, for example. So let's go action mappings. We're going to add a new action mapping by hitting the plus button. It may well just look like this. You get this little drop down, so just open your drop down, rename this to jump, hit the little drop down next to jump, and then bind it to a button by clicking on this icon here. That allows us to press any button we like, spacebar for example, and it's going to jump into this little slot here. So our action mapping that we've called jump is bound to the spacebar. Let's set up some axis mappings now. Again, it might just open up like this, so you hit the little drop down. Let's call our first axis mapping move forward with capital F. Open up the drop down. We need 2, right, for move forward, because we're going to determine what's forward and what's backwards. So next to move forward, I'm going to hit the plus button, so I've got 2 mappings here. For this one, it's going to be W with a scale of 1. This one is going to be S with a scale of -1. I'm going to do the same thing for move right, so let's create a new axis mapping. Call it move right. I need 2, one for right and one for left, so I'm going to add another one. D and A. D with a scale of 1, A with a scale of -1. So going to the right, the scale goes to 1, going to the left, the scale goes to -1. And I'll try and demonstrate that a little bit more clearly for you. We need 2 more, one for looking up and down, and one for looking right and left. So another axis mapping, we're going to call this look up. Now we don't need 2 for this one, because we're going to bind it to the mouse's axis. Whoopsie daisy, we're going to bind it to the mouse's axis, so I don't need to determine up and down, but I can't use this button here, so I'm going to have to search for it. So I'm going to click where it says none, because this is up and down. I'm going to search for mouse Y axis, and then let's add another axis mapping, and this one I'm going to call look right, and this time I'm going to bind it to the mouse X axis. So up and down is Y, left and right is X. I'm probably going to have to invert that scale later, but we'll get to that. We'll just see how it goes. So we've got jump, move forward, move right, look up, look right. Remember, you don't need a move backwards and a move right. You don't need a look down, you don't need a look left. Okay. Right. Next is to actually apply these to our character. So let's go back to our character, back to our main window here. We'll double click to open up our character. I'll quickly talk through the components. We've got self components here, which have various bits and pieces that we're not really going to need right now, so I won't talk too much about that. We have got a capsule component. This capsule component we will use for crouching, and obviously this determines the shape of our character, how it collides with the world around it. The taller we make this, the taller the character will be. The wider we make it, the wider the character will be. We've got an arrow component here, which basically does nothing. It doesn't get rendered in game, but it does show us which way the forward direction or the forward vector of our character is. We've got an empty mesh component, which we could fill with like a full rigged mesh of a character, or like a set of arms, for example, but that's empty and we don't need it right now anyway. And then we've got the character movement component, which has got a whole load of settings in here for how our character moves around. So the amount of gravity that's applied to our character, how quickly it can walk, how quickly it can swim, its jump height, the various bits and pieces. There's a whole load of settings in here for how our character actually moves around. We do need a new component, however. We are going to need a camera. So let's, up in the top left hand corner in the components list, click the add button and search for cam, and we're just going to add a normal camera, not a cinematic camera, just a standard camera. Let's lift it up so it's close to the top of our player, so around about there will probably do. And let's press compile and save. Okay, next thing we need to do is get our character moving, so we're going to come over to our event graph here, and let's get rid of these starter nodes because we don't need them. So the first thing we're going to do is right click and search for our first axis event, and let's start with jump, actually nice and simple. So let's search for jump. We're looking for our action event jump. You can see we've got pressed and released, and just to show you how this works, I'm just going to demonstrate this. You don't need to do this. I'm going to take pressed out, and I'm going to print string the word pressed, and then from released, I'm going to search for and add another print string, and I'm going to get it to say released. So these white pins here are called execution pins, right? So when I press whatever button I've bound to jump, which is the space bar, this will execute. When I release it, this will execute. So in other words, when I press the space bar, it's going to say the word pressed on screen, and when I release the space bar, it's going to say the word released on screen. So let's compile and save that, press play. Let's have a quick look. If I press it, you see pressed in the top left. If I release it, you see released in the top left. Over and over and over again. So that's just a little bit of an explanation. So I'm pressing and holding, and it just executes pressed once, and then I'm releasing and it executes released once. That's how an action mapping works. So let's get rid of these print strings. All I'm going to do is say, right, when it's pressed, I want to jump. So this jump function is built in as part of our character movement component, so that's very, very useful. And if I wanted to, I'm also going to include a stop jumping, and that's relevant for if you want to add in the ability to hold jump to jump higher, like the first Mario platformer, for example. The longer the player holds jump, the higher Mario will jump. So if you press it once and then release it very, very quickly, you'll do a small jump. If you press and hold, you'll do a long jump. We haven't programmed that in yet, or rather turned that option on, but we'll put that there for the time being. So let's compile and save, press play to test it out, click the screen once. You can see our character is now jumping. I can hold it, doesn't really matter. We're jumping. So that's our first bit of input done. We can highlight all of these, press the C key, and comment this as jump. So let's move on to movement. So we're going to come down to a bit of empty space. Let's right click and we're going to search for move forward. And we want the axis event move forward. Now I'm just going to quickly demonstrate the difference between our action event and our axis event. So again, you don't need to do this, it's just to show you. Feel free to follow along if you like. The axis event fires continuously as opposed to when a key has been pressed, okay? So in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to print string the value of our axis. So I'm just going to plug in the axis value into our print string, and you'll see what it's going to do there is convert this float value, which is a number with a decimal point, into a string, and it's going to print it on the screen for us, okay? So if you remember that scale from -1 to 1, when I'm not pressing W or S, the axis value is firing off 0, and you can see it's constantly firing. When I hold in W, you can see it goes to 1, and then when I release it, it goes back to 0, and when I hold down S, it goes to -1, and when I release it, it goes down to 0 again. Now I'm going to grab my controller, plug that in, and I'll demonstrate what difference that makes. Alright, I've got my controller plugged in. I am going to have to go to our action and axis mappings to set this up. So let's go back to the project settings. For move forward, I'm going to add another mapping here. I can click on this icon here, and if I just push forward on my left thumbstick on the Y-axis, it's going to apply it. And then I'm going to do the same for move right. This time I'm going to move the thumbstick to the right. You can see it's put in the Y-axis for move forward and the X-axis for move right. For look up, I'm going to use the right thumbstick, Y-axis, and for look right, I'm going to use the right thumbstick, X-axis. I can do jump as well. Oops. Add another one, and I'll just bind it to the face button top. So that'll be like your Y button on your Xbox controller or your triangle button on your PlayStation controller. I might change that at some point if I don't like it, but that's the beauty of it, I can. So now I've added in thumbstick controls and button controls for jumping. So let's go back to our player character. I'm going to press play again, and I'm going to demonstrate what happens when I push up on the thumbstick. So if I push up ever so slightly, you can see the number goes between 0 and 1, and the further I push that thumbstick, it gradually reaches 1. If I release it instantly, it goes back to 0, and I can also do the same on the way down as well. I'm going to hold it there, so roughly about halfway. So close. Ooh, that's about as close as I'm going to get it. That's just to demonstrate what that axis value is doing as opposed to the action mappings. Let's press escape. That was really just to demonstrate for you. Let's get this thing moving now. So we'll get rid of that. Okay, movement. So we've got our move forward event here. Let's take the execution pin out of there, and we're going to search for add movement input. The target is this particular pawn. The direction is going to be determined by which way the character is facing, and the scale value comes from our axis value. So the first thing we can do is take our axis value and plug that into the scale value of our character. Now we need to determine which way our character is facing so that we can determine which way is forward for our character. So obviously moving forward for a first person character is completely relative to which way you are facing. So let's get the rotation of our character. So to do that, we're going to right click on a bit of empty space, and we're going to search for get control rotation. We are going to isolate the Z axis because we don't care about the X and the Y. The X and the Y are our roll and pitch. We only care about the yaw of our character. So let's right click on this return value and split it into its X, Y and Z values. To the right of this, we're going to right click and search for not get but make rotator. So we're going to make a new rotator, and we're going to plug in the Z to the Z. So what we've done there is we've gotten the rotation of our character and we've isolated the Z rotation because we do not care about the X and the Y. From there, we're going to take our new rotator value, plug that, pull that pin out, and search for get forward vector. So now we're just getting the forward vector of the character's Z rotation, and we'll plug that into world direction. If we compile and save and press play, we should now be able to move backwards and forwards. We can't move left and right yet, and we can't look around. Let's get left and right moving. So we're going to right click, and we're going to get our move right axis event. Again, we're going to take that execution pin out and search for add movement input. We're going to take our axis value and plug that into the scale value, and then from our character's Z rotation, now let's go for get right vector, and we'll plug that into our world direction. Compile, save, press play. We can now move left and right, backwards and forwards. Lovely. Now it's time to look left and right. The first thing that we need to do here is select our camera. In fact, I'll show you what happens if we don't do this. Okay, so let's just deliberately make a mistake first. Okay, so moving left and right, looking left and right and up and down is very simple. We're just going to right click and search for look up. Get our axis event for look up. And we are going to add controller, and because it's looking up, we want pitch input. And let's add our axis value in there. And now let's look right, and this time we are going to add controller your input for looking left and right. Now I'm going to show you why this is not going to work, so let's compile and save, press play. We can look left and right, but we can't look up and down. That's because our camera is not following our character's rotation. So let's click on the camera, and in the details tab on the far right hand side here, just search for, you can either type it in or you can just find it down here, which is use pawn control rotation. So let's turn that on. So that basically means that when the pawn rotates, the camera rotates as well. So let's compile, save. It's inverted right now, so let's fix that, but we can look left and right and up and down. I'm going to go back to my project settings, and then here with look up, I'm going to change that scale to -1 for the mouse. I didn't check it for the control pad. Let's have a quick look. For the mouse, it's now fine. For the control pad, does that feel right? Yeah, that's fine for the control pad. So as you can see now, we can look up and down, we can look left and right, and forward is always going to be forward depending on which way the character is currently facing. Backwards, left and right, all the same, depending on which way the character is facing. So that's movement done. The next thing we can do is let's add in a sprint, which is very, very simple. So we'll go to our project settings here. We're going to add in a new action mapping for sprint. So let's add a new action mapping. Let's call it sprint. We'll bind this one to the left shift key, and let's pick a button for, let's go, you know what, I'm going to go with the bottom button, and I'm actually going to change my jump to the left button just to make them next to each other. So sprint is now the bottom face button and jump is the left face button. Again, I can change these whenever I want, and I probably will. So let's go back to our player character. We can comment these, but I'll not bother for the time being. Let's right click, search for sprint. This time we are going to get a reference to our character movement component, because essentially what we're going to do here is we are going to change our character's maximum walk speed, which is here, currently set to 600 centimeters per second, depending on whether or not I'm pressing this button, which is the left shift button. So let's get a reference to our character movement component, take the pin out of that and search for set max walk speed. And we'll plug that into pressed. So when we're pressing shift, I want to set the character's maximum walk speed to double what it currently is, which is 1200. I'm going to do that again, so take the pin out again and set max walk speed. And I want to set the character's maximum walk speed back down to 600. whoops, when I release the key. So when I press the key, maximum walk speed goes to 1200. When I release it, it gets put back down to 600. Compile, save, let's test it. So normal, 600, press it in, goes to 1200, release it, back to 600. Jolly good. Let's do crouching next. So we're going to have to come back to sprint with crouch because I don't want my character to be able to sprint while crouching, so we'll get to that eventually. So there is a quick and easy way to do crouching. I'll show you the quick and easy way, and then we'll do a little bit of a slightly nicer way to make it a bit smoother. So for crouching, obviously we're going to need a new action mapping, so let's go back to our project settings and add in a new action mapping, which we will call crouch, obviously. I'm going to bind this to, first of all, the left control button, and this is always a difficult way. Let's go, some of you might want to press your thumbsticks in for this one, perhaps. I'm going to go with, yeah, let's press in the left thumbstick. So it's the gamepad left thumbstick button. Let's try that, see how that works out for me. Cool, so we've defined our mappings for crouch. Let's go back to our player character. Let's right click and search for our crouch action event. There it is. Okay, so the nice quick and easy way to do this is essentially what we're going to do is tell our capsule component to change its half height, right? The current height of our capsule component. If I just go to the viewport, you can see what will happen here. So my current half height of my capsule is 88 centimeters. If I change that to 40, you can see what happens to our capsule, right? It gets much smaller. So let's put that back up to 88. That's effectively what we're going to do. We're going to make our capsule much smaller than it currently is when we crouch. You'll see like the not so great result from that, but we'll get to that. So let's say from pressed, we want to, let's get a reference to our capsule component, pull that out, and we want to set capsule half height, and we're going to set it to, so when we press it we want to set it to 40. Let's do that again. Set capsule half height, and we're going to set it to back to its normal 88 when we release it. So when we press it, the capsule goes to a size of 40, and when we release it, it goes back to 88. I'm not sure why my volume is constantly going up and down. That's very strange. Let's press play, hold control, and what's happening here is our capsule is instantly shrinking and then falling down to the ground, and then when I release it, it instantly gets taller again and snaps back up again, so we get this not so nice snapping effect, which we can fix. Okay, so let's get rid of this for now, and this time we're going to use something called a timeline to gradually change a number over time. Okay, so we're going to change that half height over a quarter of a second rather than doing it instantly. So let's do that. Whoopsie daisy, I have turned on. Go away please. Begone. Thank you. Don't want the output log for now. Okay, so let's do this. So when we press crouch, we want to turn and activate rather a timeline. So I'm just going to right click and search for add timeline. I can give this timeline a name of the, let's say, crouch timeline. Let's double click to open up our timeline, and we need to add a new track. We're going to add a float track. I'll explain this as we go. Let's call the float track the driver, because really all we're doing is we're changing a number from 0 to 1 over a quarter of a second. Okay, so we've got time going from left to right, and then the value going from top to bottom. So we need 2 points on our timeline. So we're going to go near 0 and 0, hold left shift and left click, and then we're going to go to 0.25 and left shift and left click. Let's go back to the first one and make sure we're on exact values. So I'm going to set the time to 0 and the value to 0, and then with the second one, the time to 0.25 and the value to 1. You can see it jumps up there. So as you can see, over the course of 0 to 2.5 seconds, the value changes from 0 to 1, like so. We do need to set the length of the timeline to match our last keyframe, so let's go 0.25 for length. And if you really want to, you can add a bit of a curve to this by just right-clicking on each of these and clicking Auto for curve. And we get a little bit of a curve so it doesn't just happen in a linear fashion. Okay, so we're done with our timeline. So literally all we're doing there is changing a number from 0 to 1 over 0.25 seconds. Okay, I can demonstrate that if you like. So when I hold the button in, it's going to play the timeline. When I release the button, it's going to reverse the timeline. And I'm just going to use a print string to demonstrate how this works. So I'm going to take update into here, and then the driver into the string, and then I'll compile and save. Press play, and you can have a look in the top left hand corner. You can see when I hold control, it gradually goes to 1, and when I release it, it gradually goes to 0. And you can see I'm just releasing it so it goes back to 0. So hold it down to 1, let go, and it goes back to 0. I could increase the time that takes just to demonstrate this a little bit more clearly. I realise I'm taking a lot longer than I anticipated, but never mind. Let's say over 2 seconds instead of 0.25. You don't need to do this, this is just for demonstrating. So I hold it, and you can see it gradually goes to 1 over the course of 2 seconds, and then when I release it, it gradually goes back to 0 over the course of 2 seconds. Now watch it go. I'm going to do it like halfway. So I'm going to hold it and then let go, and it goes up and back down again. Alright, cool. So hopefully you kind of understand a little bit more about what's happening there. I'm just going to reset my values here so that we're not on 2 seconds. Back to the event graph. Get rid of this. Okay, so the reason that that number is going from 0 to 1 is because we're going to use it to drive a lerp. So let's right click and just search for lerp. And the lerp works like this. It has an alpha, an A and a B. When the alpha is at 0, the value will be at A, and when the alpha is at 1, the value will be at B. If the alpha is at 0.5, it's halfway between A and B. So we can take our number that changes, our driver, and plug that into the alpha. Our two values here for A and B can be our capsule half height when the character is standing, which is 88, and our capsule half height when the character is crouching, which is 40. So basically we're saying, right, when we press play, we are going to lerp from A to B. In other words, standing to crouching. And when we release, we're going to lerp back again from B to A, from crouching to standing. So let's bring in our capsule component, set capsule half height, plug the update in, and then the return value into the half height. So when we press our button, we lerp from A to B, and that determines the height of our character, and it will gradually crouch over the course of 0.25 seconds, and as it reverses, it'll gradually stand over the course of 0.25 seconds. So we end up with a nice smooth crouch, much better than it was before. Now we can sprint while we're crouching. So I'm crouching and I can sprint. I don't particularly want that in my game. Most games do not allow you to sprint while crouching for good reason. Doesn't make much sense. It's entirely up to you, but I'm going to show you how to prevent that. So we need to determine, we need to record whether our character is crouching or not, and to do that I'm going to use a variable called a boolean. So a boolean is a variable that can only ever be true or false. So our variable is going to say, is our character crouching, true or false? If our character is crouching, we cannot sprint. If our character is not crouching, then we can sprint. So let's come over here to the My Blueprint tab. We're going to find variables. Let's open up this variable here. Sorry, create a new variable by pressing the plus button. It's a boolean by default, and I'm going to call it is crouching. That is not how you spell crouching. Let me correct that. Is crouching. If I did want to change the variable type, I can just do it here, but I do want it to be a boolean. So what we're going to say is when we press the crouch button, we want to set our boolean to true. So is crouching becomes true, When we release it, we want to set our boolean to false, so is crouching becomes false. So let's grab is crouching and drag it in. We want to set it, and we want to set it to true. So we say, right, when we press it, set is crouching to true, and play the timeline. Likewise, let's put it in again, choose set. When we release it, we want to set is crouching to false, so this is not ticked, and we want to reverse the timeline. So you'll see that crouching changes from true to false depending on whether you are pressing or releasing the crouch button. We can now use that to check this variable when we are sprinting. So let's bring in is crouching, get it this time, take the pin out, search for branch. You can see we've now got a condition here, is crouching true or false, do something or the other depending on the result of that check. So when we press spacebar, we want to check to see if crouching is true or false. If crouching is true, we can't sprint, so do nothing. If crouching is false, we can sprint, so change the maximum walk speed to 1200. Likewise, when we release, we need to do the same thing. So let's just take the pin out of here again, search for branch. Released can plug into our branch. It's just neaten things up a little bit here. I'm just double clicking on these lines to move things around. So again, when we release, if crouching is false, we can set it back down to 600 again. So that's going to stop us from being able to sprint if we're crouching. Let's compile and save and press play. So when I'm moving normally, I can sprint. When I'm crouching, I can no longer sprint. Alright. Okay, almost there. Last thing I'm going to throw in, which is just a bit of a bonus, is how to add a toggleable flashlight or torch to your character. It's very, very simple to do so. I'm going to go into the viewport to start with. I'm going to add in a spotlight into the components. So I'm going to go add on the components and search for a spotlight. And for the sake of ease, I am going to just move it to where the camera is, and I'm going to attach it to the camera. So wherever my camera is, my spotlight will follow. So compile and save, press play. You can see that my spotlight is now attached to my camera. I'm going to put an object in there. Let's just grab a cube. I'll put it like where my character is. I'm just going to really lazy, scale it up, and I'm going to move my character around the back so we can see the shaded part. Okay, so let's check that out. Right, my spotlight is there, but I don't really like the shape of it, and it doesn't really travel very far. So let's go back to my play character. You can tinker around with the settings of your spotlight as much as you like. I'm just going to change the outer cone angle so it's a lot more narrow, and I'm going to give it an inner cone as well. So it's all fully bright on the center cone, the center circle there, and it gradually fades out to nothing as it reaches the outer circle. Yes, I can change the attenuation. Where is my attenuation? There it is, and that'll change how far it can travel. So I'm just going to yes and do that. Okay, that looks alright. You can see that my spotlight, I mean this is a brightly lit level, so it's not like you're going to see it particularly well, but for demonstration purposes that will do. Press escape. What is next? Right, toggling it on and off. So I don't want my spotlight to be on by default, right? I want to be able to turn it on when I come into the level. So I'm going to select my spotlight, scroll down until I find visible, and turn visible off. Let's compile and save, and now my spotlight is in existence but isn't actually on. Press escape. Let's set up our toggle. So back to the project settings, into the inputs, action mappings. Let's call this torch toggle. So I'm just creating a new action mapping here, torch toggle. I'm going to bind it to the F key, and on my control pad I'm going to bind it to let's say the right thumbstick button. Why not? Let's see how that works out. Cool. So I've set up my action mapping. Let's go back to my player character, into the event graph, into a bit of empty space. Let's right click and search for torch toggle. There it is. This time I'm going to use a node called a flip-flop. So I'm going to take pressed and I'm going to look for a flip-flop node. There it is, flip-flop. And a flip-flop basically executes A the first time you press it, B the second time you press it, and then A again, then B again, then A again. Just basically switches between A and B every time you press the button. Nice and easy. Just going to bring my spotlight in, get a reference to it, and I want to pull the pin out and search for set visibility. I'm going to set it to true, plug that into A. I'm going to do the same thing again. Set visibility, leave it as false and plug that into B. So the first time I press my torch toggle button, it's going to turn the visibility of the spotlight on, and then when I press it again, it'll turn it off, and then on again, then off, and then on again, and we'll just switch between the two. So let's compile and save, press play, let's go check it out, run up to the wall, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. So you've got a toggleable torch. You could obviously add like battery systems and so on and so forth to this, but that's more than I really want to cover right now because we've already done quite a lot. But that should be everything you need to set up your first person character in terms of its movement and controls, things like that. If you do want to customize the way your character moves, please come and have a look at some of these settings here. For example, maybe you want to add in like a higher jump. Currently the jump is set to 420 centimeters per second, so jump Z velocity. If I were to change that to 2000, my character can now jump super high, maybe ridiculously high, some might say. Let's just put that back again because that was outrageous. You can change the air control of the character. So right now the air control is set to 0.05, which means I have very little control of my character once I actually jump. So let's actually crank that back up again and I'll demonstrate this for you. So if I jump next to the wall here, and then I move to the right out, you see I move ever so slightly, so I'm really holding the button down as I'm jumping. I can move a little bit to the right. If I change air control to 1, which is like 100% air control, you'll see now that when I jump in the air, I'll do the exact same test. I can now jump and control my character quite a bit in mid-air. And really that's a gameplay thing for you to decide what you want. Maybe if you're doing a platformery type game, that's probably a good idea. Otherwise it's going to be very difficult to do platforming when you haven't got much control over your character. There are other things in here as well. For example, if you went into your BP character self and maybe if you have a quick search for jump, you can see you've got a jump hold time. If that's set to 0, it's just maximum jump first time you press the button. If you were to give it a hold time, the longer you hold the button, the higher the character jumps. So let's set it to 0.5 seconds, which is quite a long time to be fair. So the character's going to jump real high. So if I just tap it once, I get a relatively modest jump, even though I've set it quite high. If I hold it, I can jump much, much higher, which is why we put that stop jumping mechanism in for when we release the button, because that'll stop you from jumping to the maximum amount. So that was jump time. I'll set that back to 0. You've also got jump count here as well. So if you want to put a double jump in, you can now jump twice. Compile, save. So now I can do 1 jump, 2 jumps. Which is quite nice. So again, if you're platforming, that might be something that you're interested in. There are other bits and pieces in there. That character kind of felt a bit floaty, so maybe I can change the, I've closed all of these down now, fantastic. Gravity scale, for example. With walking, you've got like, the maximum walk speed, which we've covered. We've also got deceleration, so how quickly you slow down. There's also acceleration in here somewhere as well. I believe there it is, max acceleration, so that's how quickly your character will reach its maximum walking speed from 0. So like if I set this to 100, which is quite low, when I start walking, my character will be very slow and will gradually accelerate up to its maximum walk speed over time. However, if I was to set that to something very, very high, like whatever that number is, what is that, 1 shy of a million, I will instantly accelerate to the maximum walk speed. Just to be aware that this does not make your character move faster as a total max speed, it just makes it reach the maximum speed quicker. Anyway, that's enough. You can have a bit of experiment through a lot of these settings here. There's a whole load of things to play with. Feel free to do so. That'll do for your first person character setup. In the next video we'll start looking at things like doors and other game mechanics that you might want to include in your micro games.